Okay, I see 2 viewers. So now it's down to 1. Give it another minute. Now I see 0. Okay. Ah, I see that Eric has joined. I think it's showing me that. It's the first. Okay, yeah, it's actually telling me who's here. Nice. Oh, I see 3 people. Just want to get some kind of confirmation that Steven is here, and then I'll get going. Hey, Mike, thank you for the... Yes, I love this shirt. It was a gift. I don't know where it came from, but it's really cute. Oh, okay. Oh, your internet has perfect timing. I appreciate that. Oh, I've got 4 people now. Wow. Just, okay, we got Steven here. Glad people are a fan of the shirt. I see Katrina. Wow. And, okay, the cat's gonna be a nuisance again. I don't know why I have so many people today, but this is like the... I don't know how many time I've been doing these videos. I'm just reading this book to basically 2 people, and then whoever else wants to pop in. So this is a part of the King Killer Chronicle series, The Wise Man's Fear. It's book 2, and we're about to start chapter 13 of this. And my cat is here, so you can watch the cat if you're not interested in the story. He's gonna be bugging me while I'm reading. Anyway, so where we left off, they were taking this class taught by Illidan, who is the really quirky old man professor, or if that's the right word. Yeah. Anyway, he's teaching this class. I feel like I hope I'm being loud enough. I feel like I'm not projecting today. Try to be louder. Okay. Yeah, I think he's like, I don't know if he's a tabby, but he's got these really interesting patterns. I think he's like part Bengal or something. But I don't know. I only ever saw his mom, and she was pure black. Anyway. Louise stealing the spotlight. Enough. I'm gonna start. Okay, chapter 13. The Hunt. Determined to make a good showing of myself in Illidan's class, I tracked down Willem and negotiated an exchange of future drinks for his help navigating the archives. We made our way through the cobbled streets of the university together, the wind gusting as the huge windowless shape of the archives loomed above us across the courtyard. The words Vorfellen Renata Mori were chiseled into the stone above the massive stone doors. As we came closer, I realized my hands were sweaty. "Lord and lady, hold on for a second," I said as I stopped walking. Will raised an eyebrow at me. "I'm nervous as a new whore," I said. "Just give me a moment." "You said Lauren lifted his ban 2 days ago," Willem said. "I thought you'd be inside as soon as you had permission." "I was waiting for them to update the ledgers." I wiped my damp hands on my shirt. "I know something's going to happen," I said anxiously. "My name won't be in the book, or Ambrose will be at the desk and I'll have some sort of relapse from that plum drug and end up kneeling on his throat and screaming." "I'd like to see that," Will said. "But Ambrose doesn't work today." "That's something," I admitted, relaxing a bit. I pointed to the words above the door. "Do you know what that means?" Will glanced up. "The desire for knowledge shapes a man," he said. "Or something close to that." I like that. I took a deep breath. Right, let's go. I pulled open the huge stone doors and entered a small antechamber. Then Will tugged open the inner doors, and we stepped into the entry hall. In the middle of the room was a huge wooden desk with several large leather-bound ledgers open atop it. Several imposing doors led off in different directions. Fela sat behind the desk, her curling hair pulled back into a tail. The red light from the sympathy lamps made her look different, but no less pretty. She smiled. "Hello, Fela," I said, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt. "I heard I'm back in Lauren's good books. Could you check for me?" She nodded again and began to flip through the ledger in front of her. Her face brightened, and she pointed. Then her expression went dark. I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. "What is it?" I asked. "Is something wrong?" "No," she said. "Nothing's wrong." "You look like something's wrong," Will grumbled. "What does it say?" "Don't knock over the phone, please." Fela hesitated, then spun the book around so we could read it. "Kvath, Arliden's son, red-haired, fair-complected, young." Written next to this, in the margin in a different script, were the words, "Rue bastard." I grinned at her. "Correct on all counts. Can I go in?" She nodded. "Do you need lamps?" she asked, opening a drawer. "I do," Will said, already writing his name in a separate ledger. "I've got my own," I said, pulling my small lamp from a pocket of my cloak. Fela opened the admittance ledger and signed us in. My hand shook as I wrote, skittering the pen's nib embarrassingly, so it flicked ink across the page. Fela bottled it away and closed the book. She smiled up at me. "Welcome back," she said. I let Willem lead the way through the stacks and did my best to look properly amazed. It wasn't a hard part to play. While I'd had access to the archives for some time, I'd been forced to creep around like a thief. I had kept my lamp on its dimmest setting and avoided the main hallways for fear of accidentally running into someone. Shelves covered every bit of the stone walls. Some hallways were broad and open with high ceilings, while others formed narrow lanes barely wide enough for two people to pass if they both turned sideways. The air was heavy with the smell of leather and dust, of old parchment and binding glue. It smelled of secrets. Willem led me through twisting shelves, up some stairs, then through a long, wide hallway lined with books bound all in identical red leather. Finally, we came to a door with dim red light showing around the edges. "There are rooms set aside for private study," Willem said softly. "Reading holes. Sim and I use this one a lot. Not many people know about it." Will knocked briefly on the door before he opened it to reveal a windowless room barely larger than the table and chairs it contained. Sim sat at the table, the red light of his sympathy lamp making his face look ruddier than usual. His eyes grew wide when he saw me. "Kvath? What are you doing in here?" He turned to Willem, horrified. "Okay, sorry about that. I was getting a video call, and that interrupted the live video. So, I don't know where it left off. But I'm just, unless somebody tells me what the last thing they heard was, I'm probably just going to go back a paragraph. Okay, so shelves covered every bit of the stone walls. Some hallways were broad and open with high ceilings, while others formed narrow lanes. Oh, yeah, sorry, Eric. Your internet is fine. Narrow lanes barely wide enough for two people to pass if they both turned sideways. The air was heavy with the smell of leather and dust, of old parchment and binding glue. It smelled of secrets. Willem led me through twisting shelves, up some stairs, then through a long, wide hallway lined with books bound all in identical red leather. Finally, we came to a door with dim red light showing around the edges. I think I might have gone back a little farther than I meant to, but whatever. "There are rooms set aside for private study," Willem said softly. "Reading holes. Sim and I use this one a lot. Not many people know about it." Will knocked briefly on the door before he opened it to reveal a windowless room barely larger than the table and chairs it contained. Sim sat at the table, the red light of his sympathy lamp making his face look ruddier than usual. His eyes grew wide when he saw me. "Kvath, what are you doing in here?" He turned to Willem, horrified. "What is he doing in here?" "Lauren lifted his ban," Willem said. "Our young boy has a reading list. He's planning his first book hunt." "Congratulations," Sim beamed at me. "Can I help? I'm falling asleep here." He held out his hand. I tapped my temple. "The day I can't memorize 20 titles is the day I don't belong in the Arcanum," I said. Though that was only half the truth. The full truth was that I only owned a half-dozen precious sheets of paper. I couldn't afford to waste one on something like this. Sim pulled a folded piece of paper out of his pocket along with a nub of pencil. I need things written down, he said. Not all of us memorize ballads for fun. I shrugged and began to jot them down. It will probably go faster if we split my list 3 ways, I said. Willem gave me a look. You think you can just walk around and find books by yourself? He looked at Sim, who was grinning widely. Of course. That's not in quotes. Of course, I wasn't supposed to know anything about the layout of the stacks. Will and Sim didn't know I'd been sneaking in at nights for almost a month. It's not that I didn't trust them, but Sim couldn't lie to save his life, and Will worked as a scriv. I didn't want to force him to choose between my secret and his duty to Master Lauren. So I decided to play dumb. Oh, I'll muddle through, I said nonchalantly. It can't be that hard to figure out. There are so many books in the archives, Will said slowly, that merely reading all the titles would take you a full span. He paused, looking at me intently. 11 full days without pause for food or sleep. Oh, look at that. They finally defined what a span means. 11 days. It only took an entire book and 132 pages. Really? Sim asked. That long? Will nodded. I worked it out a year ago. It helps stop the Illyrs mewling when they must wait for me to fetch them a book. He looked at me. There are books without titles, too, and scrolls, and clays, and many languages. What's a clay? I asked. Clay tablet, Will explained. There were some of the only things to survive when Kaluptena burned. Some have been transcribed, but not all. All that's beside the point, Sim interjected. The problem is the organization. Cataloging, Will said. There have been many different systems over the years. Some masters prefer one, some prefer another, he frowned. Some create their own systems for organizing the books. I laughed. You sound like they should be pilloried for it. Perhaps, Will grumbled. I would not weep over such a thing. Sim looked at him. You can't blame a master for trying to organize things in the best way possible. I can, Willem said. If the archives were organized badly, it would be a uniform unpleasantness we could work with. But there have been so many different systems in the last 50 years. Books mislabeled, titles mistranslated. He ran his hands through his hair, sounding suddenly weary. And there are always new books coming in, needing to be catalogued. Always the lazy Illyr in tombs who want us to fetch for them. It is like trying to dig a hole in the bottom of a river. So what you're saying, I said slowly, is you find your time spent as a scriv to be both pleasant and rewarding. Sim muffled a laugh in his hands. And then there are you people, Will looked at me, his voice dangerous and low. Students given the freedom in the stacks. You come in, read half a book, then hide it so you can continue later at your own convenience. Will's hands made gripping motions as if clutching at the front of someone's shirt. Or perhaps a throat. Then you forget where you have put the book, and it is gone as surely as if you had burned it. Will pointed a finger at me. If I ever discover you have done such a thing, he said, smoldering with anger, no god will keep you safe from me. I thought guiltily about 3 books I had hidden in just this way while I was studying for exams. I promise, I said. I won't ever do that. Again. Sim stood up from the table, rubbing his hands together briskly. Right. Simply said, it's a mess in here, but if you stick to the books they have listed in Tolem's catalog, you should be able to find what you're looking for. Tolem is the system we use now. Will and I will show you where they keep the ledgers. And a few other things, Will said. Tolem is hardly comprehensive. Some of your books might require deeper digging. He turned to open the door. Oh, now you need to know why 11 days. Oh my god. I don't know, why is a week 7 days? Why is a fortnight 2 weeks? Now you're going to be thinking about that all night, aren't you? As it turned out, only 4 books on my list were in the Tolem ledgers. After that, we were forced to leave the well-organized parts of the stacks behind. Will seemed to take the list as a personal challenge, so I learned a great deal about the archives that day. Will took me to the dead ledgers, the backward stair, the bottom wing. Even so, at the end of 4 hours, we'd only managed to track down the locations of 7 books. Will seemed frustrated by this, but I thanked him heartily, telling him he'd given me everything I needed to continue the search on my own. Over the next several days, I spent almost every free moment I had in the archives, hunting the books on Elodin's list. I wanted nothing more than to start this class with my best foot forward, and I was determined to read every book he had given us. The first was a travelogue I found rather enjoyable. The second was some rather bad poetry, but it was short, and I forced my way through by gritting my teeth and occasionally closing one eye, so as not to damage the entirety of my brain. Third was a book of rhetorical philosophy, ponderously written. Then came a book detailing wildflowers in northern Artois, a fencing manual with some rather confusing illustrations, Another book of poetry, this one thick as a brick and even more self-indulgent than the first. It took hours, but I read them all. I even went so far as to take notes on 2 of my precious pieces of paper. Next came, as near as I could tell, the Journal of a Madman. While it sounds interesting, it was really only a headache pressed between covers. The man wrote in a tight script with no spaces between the words, no breaks for paragraphs, no punctuation, no consistent grammar or spelling. That was when I began to skim. The next day, when confronted with 2 books written in Morrigan, a series of essays concerning crop rotation and a monograph of vintage mosaics, I stopped taking notes. The last handful of books I merely flipped through, wondering why Aeladin would want us to read a 200-year-old tax ledger from a barony in the small kingdoms, an outdated medical text, and a badly translated morality play. While I quickly lost my fascination with reading Aeladin's books, I still delighted in hunting them down. I irritated more than a few scribs with my constant questions. Who was in charge of reshelving? Where were the vintage dictums kept? Who had the keys to the 4th basement scroll storage? Where did the damaged books go while they were waiting to be repaired? In the end, I found 19 of the books, all of them except En Temerant Voistra, and that one was not from lack of trying. At my best guess, the entire venture took nearly 50 hours of searching and reading. I arrived at Aeladin's next class 10 minutes early, proud as a priest. I brought my 2 pages of careful notes, eager to impress Aeladin with my dedication and thoroughness. All 7 of us showed up for class before the noon bell. The door to the lecture hall was closed, so we stood in the hallway waiting for Aeladin to arrive. We shared stories about our search through the archives and speculated as to why Aeladin considered these books important. Fela had been a scrib for years, and she had only found 17 of them. Nobody had found En Temerant Voistra, or even a mention of it. Aeladin still hadn't arrived by the time the noon bell rang, and at 15 minutes past the hour I grew tired of standing in the hallway and tried the door to the lecture hall. At first the handle didn't move at all, but when I jiggled it in frustration, the latch turned and the door opened a crack. "I thought it was locked," Inissa said, frowning. "Just stuck," I said, pushing it open. We entered the huge empty room and walked down the stairs to the front row of seats. On the large slate in front of us, written in Aeladin's oddly tidy handwriting, was a single word: discuss. We settled into our seats and waited, but Aeladin was nowhere to be seen. We looked at the slate, then at each other, at a loss for what exactly we were supposed to do. From the looks on everyone's faces, I wasn't the only one who was irritated. I'd spent 50 hours digging up his damn useless books. I'd done my part. Why wasn't he doing his? The 7 of us waited for the next 2 hours, chatting idly, waiting for Aeladin to arrive. He didn't. That was the end of that chapter. 1 second. Oh, I'm reading your comments now. Wait. This absolutely will not end well. I mean, as soon as he said, I was hoping to impress him, I'm like, you're not going to impress him. Nothing you have ever done to try to impress him has worked. Ever. Okay. Chapter 14. The Hidden City. While the hours I'd wasted hunting for Aeladin's books left me profoundly irritated, I emerged from the experience with a solid working knowledge of the archives. The most important thing I learned was that it was not merely a warehouse filled with books. The archives was like a city unto itself. It had roads and winding lanes. It had alleys and shortcuts. Just like a city, parts of the archives teemed with activity. The scriptorium held rows of desks where scribes toiled over translations or copied faded texts into new books with fresh, dark ink. The sorting hall buzzed with activity as scribes sifted and reshelved books. The buggery was not at all what I expected, thank goodness. Instead, it proved to be the place where new books were decontaminated before being added to the collection. Apparently all manner of creatures love books, some devouring parchment and leather, others with a taste for paper or glue. Bookworms were the least of them, and after listening to a few of Willem's stories, I wanted nothing more than to wash my hands. So bookworms are a literal, actual thing. Okay. Cataloger's mew, the bindery, bolts, palimpsest. All of them were busy as beehives, full of quiet, industrious scribs. But other parts of the archives were quite the opposite of busy. The acquisitions office, for example, was tiny and perpetually dark. Through the window I could see that one entire wall of the office was nothing but a huge map with cities and roads marked in such detail that it looked like a snarled loom. The map was covered in a layer of clear alchemical lacquer, and there were notes written at various points in red grease pencil, detailing rumors of desirable books and the last known positions of the various acquisition teams. Tomes was like a great public garden. Any student was free to come and read the books shelved there, or they could submit a request to the scribs, who would grudgingly head off into the stacks to find, if not the exact book you wanted, then at least something closely related. But the stacks comprised the vast majority of the archives. That was where the books actually lived, and just like in any city, there were good neighbors and bad. In the good neighborhoods, and bad. In the good neighborhoods, everything was properly organized and cataloged. In these places, a ledger entry would lead you to a book as simply as pointing a finger. Then there were the bad neighborhoods, sections of the archives that were forgotten or neglected, or simply too troublesome to deal with at the moment. These were places where books were organized under old catalogs or under no catalog at all. There were walls of shelves like mouths with missing teeth, where long-gone scribs had cannibalized an old catalog to bring books into whatever system was fashionable at the time. 30 years ago, 2 entire floors had gone from good neighborhood to bad when the Larkin ledger books were burned by a rival faction of scribs. And of course, there was the 4-plate door, the secret at the heart of the city. It was nice to go strolling in the old neighborhood, in the good neighborhoods. I can read, I swear. It was pleasant to go looking for a book and find it exactly where it should be. It was easy, comforting, quick. But the bad neighborhoods were fascinating. The books there were dusty and disused. When you opened one, you might read words no eyes had touched for hundreds of years. There was treasure there among the dross. It was in those places I searched for the Chandrian. I looked for hours, and I looked for days. A large part of the reason I had come to the university was because I wanted to discover the truth about them. Now that I finally had easy access to the archives, I made up for lost time. But despite my long hours of searching, I found hardly anything at all. There were several books of children's stories that featured Chandrian engaged in minor mischief, like stealing pies and making milk go sour. Others had them bargaining like demons in auteur and morality plays. Scattered through these stories were a few thin threads of fact, but nothing I didn't already know. The Chandrian were cursed. Signs showed their presence: blue flame, rot and rust, a chill in the air. My hunt was made more difficult by the fact that I couldn't ask anyone for help. If word spread that I was spending my time reading children's stories, it would not improve my reputation. More important, one of the few things I knew about the Chandrian was that they worked to viciously repress any knowledge of their own existence. They'd killed my troupe because my father had been writing a song about them. In Trebon, they'd destroyed an entire wedding party because some of the guests had seen pictures of them on a piece of ancient pottery. Given these facts, talking about the Chandrian didn't seem like the wisest course of action. So I did my own searching. After days, I abandoned hope of finding anything so helpful as a book about the Chandrian, or even anything so substantial as a monograph. Still, I read on, hoping to find a scrap of truth hidden somewhere, a single fact, a hint, anything. But children's stories are not rich in detail, and what few details I found were obviously fanciful. Where did the Chandrian live? In the clouds, in dreams, in a castle made of candy. What were their signs? Thunder, the darkening of the moon. One story even mentioned rainbows. Who would write that? Why make a child terrified of rainbows? Names were easier to come by, but all were obviously stolen from other sources. Almost all of these were names of demons mentioned in the Book of the Path, or from some play, primarily Dionica. One painfully allegorical story named the Chandrian after 7 well-known emperors from the days of the Auturan Empire. That at least gave me a brief, bitter laugh. Eventually I discovered a slim volume called The Book of Secrets, buried deep in the dead ledgers. It was an odd book, arranged like a bestiary but written like a children's primer. It had pictures of fairy tale creatures like ogres, trow, and dennerlings. Each entry had a picture accompanied by a short, insipid poem. Of course, the Chandrian were the only entry without a picture. Instead, there was just an empty page framed in decorative scrollwork. The accompanying poem was less than useless. The Chandrian move from place to place, but they never leave a trace. They hold their secrets very tight, but they never scratch and they never bite. They never fight and they never fuss. In fact, they are quite nice to us. They come and they go in the blink of an eye, like a bright bolt of lightning out of the sky. It must be interesting to write a book so well and then purposely write something that's kind of like not great. Irritating as it was to read something like this, it made one point abundantly clear. To the rest of the world, the Chandrian were nothing more than childish fairy stories, no more real than shamblemen or unicorns. I said that word really weird. I knew differently, of course. I had seen them with my own eyes. I had talked to Black-Eyed Cinder. I had seen Haliax wearing shadow all around him like a mantle. So I continued my fruitless search. It didn't matter what the rest of the world believed. I knew the truth, and I've never been one to give up easily. Let's take a sip of water real quick. Library gentrification. I settled into the rhythm of a new term. As before, I attended classes and played music at Anchors. Why did my voice get worse after I just drank the water? But most of my time was spent in the archives. I had lusted after them for so long that being able to walk through the front doors any time I wanted seemed almost unnatural. Even my continuing failure to find anything factual about the Chandrian didn't sour the experience. As I hunted, I became increasingly distracted by other books I found. A handwritten medicinal herbal with watercolor pictures of various plants. A small quarto book of 4 plays I'd never heard of before. A remarkably engaging biography of Hevered the Wary. I spent entire afternoons in the reading holes, missing meals and neglecting my friends. More than once I was the last student out of the archives before the scribs locked the doors for the night. I would have slept there if such things were allowed. Some days, if my schedule was too tight for me to settle in for a long stretch of reading, I would simply walk the stacks for a handful of minutes between classes. I was so infatuated with my new freedoms that I did not make it over the river to Imra for many days. When I did return to the Grey Man, I brought a calling card I'd fashioned from a scrap of parchment. I thought Denna would be amused by it. But when I arrived, the officious porter in the Grey Man's parlor told me no, he could not deliver my card. No, the young lady was no longer in residence. Really surprised. No, he could not take a message for her. No, he did not know where she had gone. Shocking. She's gone again. There's a really short chapter next, so I might read more than one. Kel's surprise. Chapter 15. Interesting fact. Elodin strode into the lecture hall, almost an hour late. His clothes were covered in grass stains, and there were dried leaves tangled in his hair. He was grinning. Today there were only 6 of us waiting for him. Jarrett hadn't shown up for the last 2 classes. Given the scathing comments he'd made before disappearing, I doubted he'd be coming back. "Now!" Elodin shouted without preamble. "Tell me things!" This was his newest way to waste our time. At the beginning of every lecture, he demanded an interesting fact he had never heard before. Of course, Elodin himself was the sole arbiter of what was interesting, and if the first fact you provided didn't measure up, or if he already knew it, he would demand another, and another, until you finally came up with something that amused him. He pointed at Brian. "Go!" "Spiders can breathe underwater," she said promptly. Elodin nodded. "Good." He looked at Fenton. "There's a river south of Ventus that flows the wrong way," Fenton said. "It's a saltwater river that runs inland from the South Sea." Elodin shook his head. "Already know about that." Fenton looked down at a piece of paper. "Emperor Ventorin once passed a law—" "Boring!" Elodin interjected, cutting him off. "If you drink more than 2 quarts of seawater, you'll throw up?" Fenton asked. Elodin worked his mouth speculatively, as if he were trying to get a piece of gristle out of his teeth. Then he gave a satisfied nod. "That's a good one." He pointed to Uresh. "You can divide infinity an infinite number of times, and the resulting pieces will still be infinitely large," Uresh said in his odd Lenati accent. "But if you divide a non-infinite number an infinite number of times, the resulting pieces are non-infinitely small. Since they are non-infinitely small, but there are an infinite number of them, if you add them back together, their sum is infinite. This implies any number is, in fact, infinite." "Wow," Elodin said after a long pause. He leveled a serious finger at the Lenati man. "Uresh, your next assignment is to have sex." Didn't expect that to be the sentence. "If you do not know how to do this, see me after class." He turned to look at Inissa. "The Yilish people never developed a written language," she said. "Not true," Elodin said. "They used a system of woven knots." He made a complex motion with his hands, as if braiding something. "And they were doing it long before we started scratching pictograms on the skins of sheep." "I didn't say they lacked recorded language," Inissa muttered. "I said written language." Elodin managed to convey his vast boredom in a simple shrug. Inissa frowned at him. "Fine. There's a type of dog in Scaria that gives birth through a vestigial penis," she said. "Wow," Elodin said. "Okay, yeah." He pointed to Fela. 80 years back, the Medica discovered how to remove cataracts from eyes," Fela said. "I already know that," Elodin said, waving his hand dismissively. "Let me finish," Fela said. "When they figured out how to do this, it meant they could restore sight to people who had never been able to see before. These people hadn't gone blind. They these people hadn't gone blind, they had been born blind. Eladin cocked his head curiously. Fela continued. After they could see, they were shown objects, a ball, a cube, and a pyramid all sitting on a table. Fela made the shapes with her hands as she spoke. Then the physicers asked them which one of the three objects was round. Fela paused for effect, looking at all of us. They couldn't tell just by looking at them. They needed to touch them first. Only after they touched the ball did they realize it was the round one. Eladin threw his head back and laughed delightedly. Really? He asked her. She nodded. Fela wins the prize! Eladin shouted, throwing up his hands. He reached into his pocket and brought out something brown and oblong, pressing it into her hands. She looked at it curiously. It was a milkweed pod. Kvoth hasn't gone yet, Bran said. Doesn't matter, Eladin said in an offhand way. Kvoth is crap at interesting fact. I scowled as loudly as I could. Fine, Eladin said. Tell me what you have. The Adem mercenaries have a secret art called the Lethani, I said. It is the key to what makes them such fierce warriors. Eladin cocked his head to one side. Really? He asked. What is it? I don't know, I said flippantly, hoping to irritate him. Like I said, it's a secret. Eladin seemed to consider this for a moment, then shook his head. No. Interesting, but not a fact. It's like saying the Sealdish moneylenders have a secret art called financia that makes them such fierce bankers. There's no substance to it. He looked at me again, expectantly. I tried to think of something else, but I couldn't. My head was full of fairy tales and dead-ended research into the Chandrian. See, Eladin said to Bran, he's crap. I just don't know why we're wasting our time with this, I snapped. Do you have better things to do? Eladin asked. Yes, I exploded angrily. I have 1,000 more important things to do, like learning about the name of the wind. Eladin held up a finger, attempting to strike a sage pose and failing because of the leaves in his hair. Small facts lead to great knowing, he intoned, just as small names lead to large names. He clapped his hands and rubbed them together eagerly. Right, Fela, open your prize and we can give Kvoth the lesson he so greatly desires. Fela cracked the dry husk of the milkweed pod. The white fluff of the floating seeds spilled out into her hands. Master Namer motioned for her to toss it into the air. Fela threw it, and everyone watched the mass of white fluff sail toward the high ceiling of the lecture hall, then back heavily to the ground. God damn it, Eladin said. He stalked over to the bundle of seeds, picked it up, and waved it around vigorously until the air was full of gently floating puffs of milkweed seed. Then Eladin started to chase the seeds wildly around the room, trying to snatch them out of the air with his hands. He clambered over chairs, ran across the lecture's dais, and jumped onto the table at the front of the room. All the while he grabbed at the seeds. At first he did it one-handed, like you'd catch a ball, but he met with no success, and so he started clapping at them, the way you'd swat a fly. When this didn't work either, he tried to catch them with both hands, the way a child might cup a firefly out of the air. But he couldn't get a hold of one. The more he chased, the more frantic he became. The faster he ran, the wilder he grabbed. This went on for a full minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10. It might have gone on for the entire class period, but eventually he tripped over a chair and tumbled painfully to the stone floor, tearing open the leg of his pants and bloodying his knee. Clutching his leg, he sat on the ground and let loose with a string of angry cursing, the like of which I had never heard in my entire life. He shouted and snarled and spat. He moved through at least 8 languages, and even when I couldn't understand the words he used, the sound of it made my gut clench and the hair on my arms stand up. He said things that made me sweat. He said things that made me sick. He said things I didn't know it was possible to say. I expect this might have continued, but while drawing an angry breath, he sucked one of the floating milkweed seeds into his mouth and began to cough and choke violently. Eventually he spat out the seed, caught his breath, got to his feet, and limped out of the lecture hall without saying another word. This was not a particularly odd day's class under Master Illidan. I love how you actually know things about this dog. After Illidan's class, I ate a bit of lunch at Anchor's, then went to my shift in the Medica, watching more experienced Elfa diagnose and treat incoming patients. After that, I headed over the river with the hope of finding Denna. It was my 3rd trip in as many days, but it was a crisp, sunny day, and after all my time in the archives, I felt the need to stretch my legs a bit. I stopped at the Aeolian first, though it was far too early for Denna to be there. I chatted with Stanchion and Deoch before moving on to a few of the other inns I knew she occasionally frequented. Taps, Barrel and Bale, and Dog in the Wall. She wasn't at any of those either. I wandered through a few public gardens, their trees almost entirely devoid of leaves. Then I visited all the instrument shops I could find, browsing the lutes and asking if they'd seen a pretty dark-haired woman looking at harps. They hadn't. It was fully dark by then, so I stopped by the Aeolian again and wandered slowly through the crowd. Denna was still nowhere to be seen, but I did meet up with Count Thrape. We shared a drink and listened to a few songs before I left. I pulled my cloak more tightly around my shoulders as I started back to the university. Imre's streets were busier now than they had been during the day, and despite the chill in the air, there was a festival feel to the town. Music of a dozen different kinds poured from the doorways of inns and theaters. People crowded in and out of restaurants and exhibition halls. Then I heard a laugh rise high and bright over the low murmuring of the crowds. I would have recognized it anywhere. It was Denna's laugh. I knew it like the backs of my own hands. I turned around, feeling a smile spread across my face. This was always the way of it. I only seemed to be able to find her after I'd given up hope. I scanned the faces in the milling throng and found her easily. Denna stood by the doorway of a small cafe, wearing a long dress of dark blue velvet. I took a step toward her, then stopped. I watched as Denna spoke to someone standing behind the open door of a carriage. The only part of her companion I could see was the very top of his head. He was wearing a hat with a tall white plume. A moment later, Ambrose closed the carriage door. He gave her a wide, charming smile and said something that made her laugh. Lamplight glittered on the gold brocade of his jacket, and his gloves were dyed the same dark royal purple as his boots. The color should have looked garish on him, but it didn't. As I stood staring, a passing two-horse fetter cart nearly knocked me flat and trampled me, which would have been fair as I was standing in the middle of the road. The driver cursed and flicked out with his horsewhip as he went past. It caught me on the back of the neck, but I didn't even feel it. I regained my balance and looked up in time to see Ambrose kiss Denna's hand. Then, moving gracefully, he offered her his arm as they entered the cafe, together. Yeah, agreed. Frickin' Ambrose. Okay, how long is this chapter? Oh my god, okay. I'm reading 5 chapters tonight. Chapter 16, Unspoken Fear. After seeing Ambrose and Denna in Imre, I fell into a dark mood. On the walk back to the university, my head spun with thoughts of them. Was Ambrose doing this purely out of spite? How had it happened? What was Denna thinking? After a largely sleepless night, I tried not to think of it. Instead, I burrowed deep into the archives. Books are a poor substitute for female companionship, but they are easier to find. I consoled myself by hunting through the dark corners of the archives for the Chandrian. I read until my eyes burned and my head felt thick and cramped. Nearly a span passed, and I did little but attend classes and pillage the archives. For my pains, I gained lungs full of dust, a persistent headache from hours of readings by sympathy light, and a knot between my shoulder blades from hunching over a low table while I paged through the faded remains of the Gillian ledgers. I also found a single mention of the Chandrian. It was in a handwritten octavo titled A Quaint Compendium of Folk Belief. At my best guess, the book was 200 years old. The book was a collection of stories and superstitions gathered by an amateur historian in Ventus. Unlike the mating habits of the common Dracus, it made no attempt to prove or disprove these beliefs. The author had simply collected and organized the stories with occasional brief commentaries about how beliefs seemed to change from region to region. It was an impressive volume, obviously comprising years of research. There were 4 chapters about demons, 3 chapters for fairies, one of which was entirely devoted to tales of Felurian. There were pages on the Shamblemen, Rendlings, and the Trow. The author recorded songs about the Grey Ladies and White Riders, a lengthy section on Barrow Draugr. There were 6 chapters on folk magic, 8 ways to cure warts, 12 ways to talk to the dead, 22 love charms. The entire entry on the Chandrian was less than half a page. This is going to take up most of the chapter, just this part. Of the Chandrian there is little to be said. Every man knows of them. Every child chants their song. Yet folk tell no stories. For the price of a small beer, a farmer will talk 2 hours on Dannerlings, but mention the Chandrian, his mouth goes tight as a spinner's ass, and he is touching iron and pushing back his chair. Many think it had bad luck. Oh my god, I can't read. Many think it bad luck to speak of the Fae, yet still folk do. What makes the Chandrian different, I know not. One rather drunk tanner in the town of Hillsborough said in hushed tones, "If you talk of them, they come for you." This seems the unspoken fear of these common folk. So I write what I have gleaned, all common and inspecific. The Chandrian are a group of various number, likely 7, given their name. They appear and commit diverse violence for no clear reason. There are signs which herald their arrival, but there is no agreement as to these. Blue flame is the most common, but I have also heard of wine going sour, blindness, crops withering, unseasonable storms, miscarriage, and the sun going dark in the sky. Altogether, I have found them a frustrating and profitless area of inquiry. I closed the book. Frustrating and profitless had a familiar ring to it. The worst part wasn't that I already knew everything written in the entry. The worst part was that this was the best source of information I'd managed to discover in over 100 long hours of searching. And that's that chapter. Oh, Bubba. You're so cranky, aren't you? Okay, another short one. Chapter 17. Interlude. Parts. Kvoth held up his hand, and Chronicler lifted his pen from the paper. "Let's pause there for a moment," Kvoth said, nodding toward the window. "I can see Cobb coming down the road." Kvoth stood and brushed off the front of his apron. "Might I suggest the two of you take a moment to compose yourselves?" He nodded to Chronicler. "You look like you've just been doing something you shouldn't." Kvoth walked calmly, to stand behind the bar. Careful. Whiny baby. Nothing could be further from the truth, of course. Chronicler, you are bored, waiting for work. That is why your riding gear is out. You wish you weren't stuck without a horse in this nowhere town, but you are, and you're going to make the best of it. Bast grinned. "Ooh, give me something too." "Play to your strengths, Bast," Kvoth said. "You're drinking with our only customer because you're a shiftless layabout nobody would ever dream of asking for help in the fields." Bast grinned eagerly. "Am I bored too?" "Of course you are, Bast. What else is there to be?" He folded the linen cloth and laid it on the bar. "I, on the other hand, am too busy to be bored. I am bustling about, tending to the 100 small tasks that keep the inn running smoothly." He looked at the two of them. "Chronicler, slouch back in your chair. Bast, if you can't stop grinning, at least start telling our friend the story about the 3 priests and the miller's daughter." Bast's wing widened. Oh my god. Bast's grin widened. "That's a good one. Everyone have their parts?" Kvoth picked up the cloth from the bar and walked through the doorway into the kitchen, saying, "Enter, old Cobb, stage left." There was the thump of feet on the wooden landing, then old Cobb stomped irritably into the Waystone Inn. He glanced past the table where Bast was grinning and making gestures to accompany some story, then made his way to the bar. "Hello, you in there, Cote?" After a second, the innkeeper came bustling in from the kitchen, drying his wet hands on his apron. "Hello there, Cobb. What can I do for you?" "Graham sent the little Owens boy to fetch me," Cobb said, irritated. "You have any idea why I'm here instead of Hall & Oates?" Sorry, that makes me think of the band Hall & Oates. Hall & Oates. Cote shook his head. "I thought he was bringing in the Miriam's wheat today." "Damn foolishness," Cobb muttered. "We're in for rain tonight, and I'm standing here with dry oats stacked in my field." "Since you're here anyway," the innkeeper said, hopefully. Careful. "Can I interest you in some cider? Pressed it fresh this morning." Some of the irritation faded from the old man's weathered face. "Since I'm waiting anyway," he said, "a mug of cider would be proper nice." Cote went into the back room and returned with a pottery jug. Come on, brain. You can do this. There was the sound of more feet on the landing outside, and Graham came through the door with Jake, Carter, and the smith's apprentice all in tow. Cobb turned to glare at them. "What's so damned important it's worth hauling me into this town this time of morning?" he demanded. "Daylight's burning." There was a sudden burst of laughter from the table where Chronicler and Bast sat. Everyone turned to see Chronicler flushing a bright red, laughing and covering his mouth with one hand. Bast was laughing too, pounding at the table. Graham led the others to the bar. "I found out Carter and the boy are helping the Orisons take their sheep to market," he said. "Off to Baden, wasn't it?" Carter and the smith's apprentice nodded. "I see." Old Cobb looked down at his hands. "You'll be missing his funeral, then." Carter nodded solemnly, but Aaron's expression went stricken. He looked from face to face, but everyone else was standing very still, watching the old farmer by the bar. "Good," Cobb said at last, looking up at Graham. "It's good you fetched us in." He saw the boy's face and snorted. "You look like you just killed your cat, boy. Mutton goes to market. Shep knew that. He wouldn't think one jot less of you for doing what needs doing. He reached up to pat the smith's apprentice on the back. We'll all have a drink together to send him off proper. That's the important thing. What happens in the church tonight is just a bunch of priestly speechifying. We know how to say goodbye better than that. He looked behind the bar. Bring us out some of his favorite, Cote. The innkeeper was already moving, gathering wooden mugs and filling them with a dark brown beer from a smaller keg behind the bar. The old cob held up his mug, and the others followed suit. To our Shep. Graham spoke first. When we were kids, I broke my leg when we were out hunting, he said. I told him to run off for help, but he wouldn't leave me. He rigged a little sled together out of pure nothing and cussedness. Dragged me the whole way back to town. Everyone drank. He introduced me to my missus, Jake said. I don't know if I ever thanked him proper for that. Everyone drank. When I was sick with the croup, he came to visit me every day, Carter said. Not many folk did. Brought me soup his wife made, too. Everyone drank. He was nice to me when I first came here, the smith's apprentice said. He would tell me jokes, and once I ruined a wagon couple he'd brought in for me to fix, and he never told Master Caleb. He swallowed hard and looked around nervously. I really liked him. Everyone drank. He was braver than all of us, Cobb said. He was the first to stick a knife to that fellow last night. If the bastard had been any way normal, that would have been an end to it. Cobb's voice shook a bit, and for a moment he looked small and tired and every bit as old as he was. But that weren't the case. These ain't good days to be a brave man, but he was brave all the same. I wish I'd been brave and dead instead, and him home right now kissing his young wife. There was a murmur from the others, and they all drank to the bottom of their mugs. Graham coughed a bit before he set his down on the bar. I don't know what to say, the smith's apprentice said softly. Graham patted him on the back, smiling. You did fine, boy. The innkeeper cleared his throat, and everyone's eyes turned to him. I hope you won't think me too forward, he said. I didn't know him as well as you. Not enough for the first toast, but maybe enough for the second. He fidgeted with his apron strings, as if embarrassed for speaking up at all. I know it's early, but I'd dearly like to share a tumble of whiskey with you on Shep's account. There was a murmur of assent, and the innkeeper pulled glasses from beneath the bar and began to fill them. Not with bottle whiskey, either. The red-haired man tapped it from one of the massive barrels resting on the counter behind the bar. Barrel whiskey was a penny a swallow, so they raised their glasses with more earnest warmth than they might have otherwise. So they raised their glasses with more earnest warmth than might have otherwise been the case. What's this toast going to be, then? Graham asked. To the end of a pisser of a year? Jake said. That's no kind of toast, old Cobb grumbled at him. To the king? Aaron said. No, the innkeeper said, his voice surprisingly firm. He held up his glass. To old friends who deserved better than they got. The men on the other side of the bar nodded solemnly and tossed back their drinks. Lord and lady, that's a lovely tumble, old Cobb said respectfully, his eyes watering slightly. You're a gentleman, Cote, and I'm glad to know you. The smith's apprentice set his glass down only to have it tip onto its side and roll across the bar. He snatched it up before it skittered over the edge and turned it over, eyeing its rounded bottom suspiciously. Jake laughed a loud farmer's laugh at his bewilderment, while Carter made a point of setting his glass on the bar topside down. I don't know how they do it in Ranish, Carter said to the boy, but round here there's a reason we call it a tumble. The smith's apprentice looked properly abashed and turned his tumble upside down to match the others on the bar. The innkeeper gave him a reassuring smile before gathering up the glasses and disappearing into the kitchen. Right then, old Cobb said briskly, rubbing his hands together. We'll have a whole evening of this after the two of you get back from Baden, but the weather won't wait on me, and I don't doubt the Orisons are eager to be on the road. After they filtered out of the waystone in a loose group, Kvoth emerged from the kitchen and returned to the table where Bast and Chronicler sat. I liked Shep, Bast said quietly. Cobb might be a bit of a crusty old cuss, but he knows what he's talking about most of the time. Cobb doesn't know half of what he thinks he does, Kvoth said. You saved everyone last night. If not for you, it would have gone through the room like a farmer threshing wheat. That just isn't true, Rushy, Bast said, his tone plainly offended. You would have stopped it. That's what you do. The innkeeper shrugged the comment away, unwilling to argue. Bast's mouth formed into a hard, angry line, his eyes narrowing. Still, Chronicler said softly, breaking the tension before it grew too thick, Cobb was right. It was a brave thing to do. You have to respect that. No, I don't, Kvoth said. Cobb was right about that. These aren't good times to be brave. He motioned for Chronicler to pick up his pen. Still, I wish I'd been braver and Shep was home kissing his young wife, too. mean, there's one more chapter. It's not super short like these last couple have been, but it's not long either. And I think it's been under an hour. So, if you guys want one more, let me know. If not, I can just stop here. It's up to you. We made pretty good time. That was, I think, 5 chapters we just read. Yeah, and I totally relate to that. I mean, everyone does. Should. It's very relevant, surprisingly relevant. That. Alright. You're down for more. I don't hear any dissent from Stephen yet. Let's see. Says he wants to stop. We'll give it another. Okay, cool. Yay! Alright, chapter 18. Wine and Blood. I should take another sip of water, though. Eventually, Will and Sim pulled me from the warm embrace of the archives. I struggled and cursed them, but they were firm in their convictions, and the 3 of us braved the chill wind on the road to Imra. We made our way to the Aeolian, claiming a table near the eastern hearth where we could watch the stage and keep our backs warm. After a drink or two, I felt the book-longing fade to a dull ache. The 3 of us talked and played cards, and eventually I began to enjoy myself, despite the fact that Denna was doubtless out there somewhere, hanging on Ambrose's arm. After several hours, I sat slouched in my chair, drowsy and warm from the nearby fire, while Will and Sim bickered about whether the High King of Motive was a true ruling monarch or merely a figurehead. I was nearly asleep when a heavy bottle knocked down hard onto our table, followed by a delicate chime of wine glasses. Denna stood next to our table. "Play along," she said under her breath. "You've been waiting for me. I'm late and you're upset." Wearily, I struggled upright in my seat and tried to blink myself awake. Sim leaped to the challenge. "It's been an hour," he said, scowling fiercely. He tapped the table firmly with 2 fingers. "Don't think buying me a drink is going to fix matters. I want an apology." "It's not entirely my fault," Denna said, radiating embarrassment. She turned and gestured to the bar. I looked, worried. I would see Ambrose standing there, watching me smugly in his goddamn hat, but it was only a balding Sealdish man. He made a short, odd bow toward us, halfway between acknowledgement and apology. Sim scowled at him, then turned back to Denna and made a grudging gesture to the empty chair across from me. "Fine. So are we going to play corners or what?" Denna sank down into the chair, sitting with her back to the room, and leaned over to kiss Simon on the forehead. "Perfect," she said. "I was scowling too," Willem said. Denna slid him the bottle. "And for that, you may pour." She set the glasses in front of each of us. "A gift from my overly persistent suitor." She gave an irritated sigh. "They always need to give you something." She eyed me speculatively. "You're curiously mute." I rubbed a hand over my face. "I didn't expect to see you tonight," I said. "You caught me nearly napping." Willem poured a pale pink wine, then passed around the glasses while Denna examined the etching on the top of the bottle. "Serbior," she mused. "I don't even know if this is a decent vintage." "Excuse me, it's not, actually," Simon said matter-of-factly as he took his glass. "Serbior is Autoran. Only wines from Vintas have a vintage, technically." He took a sip. "Really?" I asked, looking at my own glass. Sim nodded. "It's a common misuse of the word. It's like the champagne argument." Denna took a drink and nodded to herself. "Good wine, though," she said. "Is he still at the bar?" "He is," I said without looking. "Well then," she smiled, "it seems you're stuck with me." "Have you ever played corners?" Sim asked hopefully. "I'm afraid not," Denna said, "but I'm a quick study." Sim explained the rules with help from Will and myself. Denna asked a few pointed questions, showing she understood the gist of it. I was glad. Since she was sitting across the table from me, she was going to be my partner. "What do you usually play for?" she asked. "Depends," Will said. "Sometimes we play by the hand, sometimes by the set." "For a set of hands, then," Denna said. "How much?" "We can do a practice set first," Sim said, brushing his hair out of his eyes, "since you're just learning and all." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't need any special treatment." She reached into a pocket and brought a coin up onto the table. "A jot too much for you boys?" It was too much for me, especially with a partner who had just learned the game. "Be careful with these 2, I said. "They play for blood." "In point of fact," Willem said, "I have no use for blood, and play for money instead." He fingered through his purse until he found a jot, which he pressed firmly onto the table. "I am willing to play a practice game, but if she finds the thought insulting, I will thrash her and take whatever she is willing to lay on the table." Denna grinned at that. You're my kind of guy, Will. The first hand went fairly well. Denna mislaid a trick, but we couldn't have won anyway, as the cards were against us. But the second hand, she made a mistake in the bidding. Then, when Sim corrected her, she got flustered and bid wildly. Then she accidentally led out of turn, not a huge mistake, but she led the Jack of Hearts, which let everyone know exactly what sort of hand she had. She realized it too, and I heard her mutter something distinctly unladylike under her breath. True to their word, Will and Sim moved in ruthlessly to take advantage of the situation. Given the weak cards in my hand, there wasn't much I could do but sit and watch as they won the next two tricks and began to close on her like hungry wolves. Except they couldn't. She pulled a clever card force, then produced the King of Hearts, which didn't make any sense as she tried to lead the Jack before. Then she produced the Ace, too. I love how he's like just describing all of the moves she's making when the reader does not know how to play this game at all. This is fun. I realized her fumbling misplay had been an act slightly before Will and Sim. I managed to keep it off my face until I saw the dim realization creep onto their expressions. Then I started to laugh. Don't be smug, she said to me. I had you fooled too. You looked like you were going to be sick when I showed the Jack. She put her hand in front of her mouth and made her eyes wide and innocent. Oh my, I've never played corners before. Could you teach me? Is it true that sometimes people play for money? Denna snapped down another card onto the table and gathered in the trick. Please. You lot should be glad I'm giving you a slap on the hand instead of the profound full-night fleecing you deserve. She mopped up the rest of the hand relentlessly, and it gave us such a solid lead that the rest of the set was a foregone conclusion. Denna never missed a trick after that, and played with enough cunning flair to make Manet seem like a dray horse by comparison. That was instructional, Will said as he slid his jot toward Denna. I might need to lick my wounds a bit. Denna lifted her glass in a salute. To the gullibility of the well-educated. We touched our glasses to hers and drank. You lot have been curiously absent, Denna said. I've been keeping an eye out for you for almost 2 span. Why's that? Sim asked. Denna gave Will and Sim a calculating look. You two are students at the university too, aren't you? The special one that teaches magic? That's us, Sim said agreeably. We are chock full of arcane secrets. We tinker with dark forces better left alone, Will said nonchalantly. It's called the Arcanum, by the way, I pointed out. Denna nodded seriously as she leaned forward, her expression intent. Between the 3 of you, I'm guessing you know how most of it works. She looked at us. So tell me, how does it work? It? I asked. Magic, she said. Real magic. Will, Sim, and I exchanged glances. It's complicated, I said. Denna shrugged and leaned back in her chair. I have all the time in the world, she said, and I need to know how it works. Show me. Do some magic. The 3 of us shifted uncomfortably in our seats. Denna laughed. We're not supposed to, I said. What? She asked. Does it disturb some cosmic balance? It disturbs the constables, I said. They don't take kindly to that sort of thing over here. The masters of the university don't care for it much either, Will said. They're very mindful of the university's reputation. Oh, come on now, Denna said. I heard a story about how our man Quoth called up some sort of demon wind. She jerked her thumb at the door behind her. Right in the courtyard outside. Had Ambrose told her that? It was just a wind, I said. No demon involved. They whipped him for it, too, Will said. Denna looked at him as if she couldn't tell if he were joking, then shrugged. Well, I wouldn't want to get anyone in any trouble. I almost said that correctly. She said with glaring insincerity. But I am powerfully curious, and I have secrets I am willing to offer in trade. Sim perked up at this. What sort of secrets? All the vast and varied secrets of womankind, she said with a smile. I happen to know several things that can help improve your failing relations with the gentler sex. Sim leaned closer to Will and asked in a stage whisper, Did she say failing or flailing? Will pointed at his own chest, then Sim's. Me failing, you flailing. Denna raised one eyebrow and cocked her head to one side, looking at the 3 of us expectantly. I cleared my throat uncomfortably. We're discouraged from sharing Arcanum secrets. It's not strictly against the laws of the university. It is, actually, Simon interrupted, giving me an apologetic look. Several laws. Denna gave a dramatic sigh, looking up at the high ceiling. I thought as much, she said. You lot just talk a good game. Admit it, you can't turn cream into butter. I happen to know for a fact that Sim can turn cream into butter, I said. He just doesn't like to because he's lazy. I'm not asking you to teach me magic, Denna said. I just need to know how it works. Sim looked at Will. That wouldn't fall under unsanctioned divulgence, would it? Illicit revelation, Will said grimly. Denna leaned forward conspiratorially, resting her elbows on the table. In that case, she said, I am also willing to finance a night of extravagant drinking, far above and beyond the simple bottle you see before you. She turned her gaze to Will. One of the bartenders here has recently discovered a dusty stone bottle in the basement. Not only is it fine old Scutton, drink of the kings of Sealden, it is a Morovani as well. Willem's expression didn't change, but his dark eyes glittered. I looked around the largely empty room. Orden is a slow night. We shouldn't have any trouble if we keep things quiet. I looked at the other two. Sim was grinning his boyish grin. It seems reasonable, a secret for a secret. If it is truly a Morovani, Willem said, I am willing to risk offending the master's sensibilities somewhat. Right then, Dennis said with a wide grin. You first. Sim leaned forward in his chair. Sympathy is probably the easiest to get a grip on, he said, then paused as if uncertain how to proceed. I stepped in. You know how a block and tackle lets you lift something too heavy for you to lift by hand? Denna nodded. Sympathy lets us do things like that, I said, but without all the awkward rope and pulleys. Willem dropped a pair of iron drabs onto the table and muttered a binding. He pushed the right-hand one with a finger, and the left-hand one slid across the table at the same time, mimicking the motion. Denna's eyes went a little wide at this, and while she didn't gasp, she did draw a long breath through her nose. It only then occurred to me that she'd probably never seen anything like this before. Given my studies, it was easy to forget that someone could live a mere miles from the university without ever having any exposure to even the most basic sympathy. To her credit, Denna recovered from her surprise without missing a beat. With only the slightest hesitation, she reached out a finger to touch one of the drabs. This is how the bell in my room worked, she mused. I nodded. Will slid his drab across the table, and Denna picked it up. The other drab rose off the table too, bobbing in midair. It's heavy, she said, then nodded to herself. Right, because it's like a pulley. I'm lifting both of them. Heat, light, and motion are all just energy, I said. We can't create energy or make it disappear, but sympathy lets us move it around or change it from one type into another. She put the drab back down on the table, and the other followed suit. And this is useful how? Will grunted with vague amusement. Is a water wheel useful? He asked. Is a windmill? I reached into the pocket of my cloak. Have you ever seen a sympathy lamp? I asked. She nodded. I slid my hand lamp across the table to her. They work under the same principle. They take a little bit of heat and turn it into light. It converts one type of energy into another. Like a money changer, Will said. Denna turned the lamp over in her hands curiously. Where does it get the heat? The metal itself holds heat, I explained. If you leave it on, you'll eventually feel the metal get chilly. If it gets too cold, it won't work. I pointed. I made that one, so it's pretty efficient. Just the heat from your hand should be enough to keep it working. Denna flicked the switch, and the dull red light shone out in a narrow arc. I can see how heat and light are related, she said, thoughtfully. The sun is bright and warm, same with a candle, she frowned. But motion doesn't fit into it. A fire can't push something. Think about friction, Sim chimed in. When you rub something, it gets hot. He demonstrated by running his hand back and forth vigorously across the fabric of his pants. Like this. He continued rubbing his thigh enthusiastically, unaware of the fact that, since it was happening below the level of the table, it looked more than slightly obscene. It's all just energy. If you keep doing it, you'll feel it get hot. Dennis somehow kept a straight face, but Willem started to laugh, covering his face with one hand, as if embarrassed to be sitting at the same table with Sim. Simon froze and flushed red with embarrassment. I came to his rescue. It's a good example. The hub of a wagon wheel will be warm to the touch. The heat comes from the motion of the wheel. A sympathist can make the energy go the other way, from heat into motion. I pointed to the lamp. Or from heat into light. Fine, she said. You're energy money changers. But how do you make it happen? There's a special way of thinking called alar, Willem said. You believe something so strongly that it becomes so. He lifted up one drab and the other followed it. I believe these two drabs are connected, so they are. Suddenly the other drab clattered to the tabletop. If I stop believing, it stops being so. Denna picked up the drab. So it's like faith, she said skeptically. More like strength of will, Sim said. She cocked her head. Why don't you call it strength of will, then? Alar sounds better, Willem said. I nodded. If we didn't have impressive-sounding names for things, no one would take us seriously. Denna nodded appreciatively, a smile tugging at the corners of her lovely mouth. And that's it, then? Energy and strength of will? And the sympathetic link, I said. Will's water wheel analogy is a good one. The link is like a pipe leading to the water wheel. A bad link is like a pipe full of holes. What makes a good link? Denna asked. The more similar two objects are, the better the link. Like this. I poured an inch of the pale wine into my cup and dipped my finger into it. Here is a perfect link to the wine, I said, a drop of the wine itself. I stood and walked to the nearby hearth. I murmured a binding and let a drop fall from my finger onto the hot metal andiron holding the burning logs. I sat back down just as the wine in my glass started to steam, then boil. And that, Willem said grimly, is why you never want a sympathist to get a drop of your blood. Denna looked at Willem, then back to the glass, her face going pale. Black hands, Will, Simmons said with a horrified look. What a thing to say. He looked at Denna. No sympathist would ever do something like that, he said earnestly. It's called malfeasance, and we won't do it. Ever. Denna managed a smile, though it was a bit strained. If no one ever does it, why is there a name for it? They used to, I said, but not anymore. Not for 100 years. I let the binding go, and the wine stopped boiling. Denna reached out and touched the nearby bottle. Why doesn't this wine boil too? She asked, puzzled. It's the same wine. I tapped my temple. The alar. My mind provides the focus and direction. If that's a good link, she asked, what's a bad one? Here, let me show you. I pulled out my purse, guessing coins would seem less alarming after Willem's comment. Sim, do you have a hard penny? He did, and I arranged 2 lines of coins on the table in front of Denna. I pointed to a pair of iron drabs and murmured in binding. Lift it up, I said. She picked up one drab and the other followed it. I pointed to the second pair, a drab and my single remaining silver talent. Now that one. Denna picked up the second drab and the talent followed it into the air. She moved both hands up and down like the arms of a scale. This second one's heavier. I nodded. Different metals. They're less similar, so you have to put more energy into it. I pointed to the drab and the silver penny and muttered a third binding. Denna put the first 2 drabs into her left hand, and picked up the third in her right. The silver penny followed it into the air. She nodded to herself. And this one's heavier still because it's a different shape and a different metal. Exactly, I said. I pointed to the 4th and final pair, a drab and a piece of chalk. Denna almost couldn't get her fingers underneath the drab to pick it up. It's heavier than all the others together, she said. It's got to be 3 pounds. Iron to chalk is a lousy link, Willem said. Bad transference. But you said energy couldn't be created or destroyed, Denna said. If I have to struggle to lift this tiny piece of chalk, where does the extra energy go? Clever, Willem chuckled. So clever. I went a year before I thought to ask that. He eyed her in admiration. Some energy is lost into the air. He waved one hand. Some goes into the objects themselves, and some goes into the body of the sympathist who is controlling the link. He frowned. That can get dangerful. Dangerous, Simon corrected gently. Denna looked at me. So right now you're believing each of these drabs is connected to each of these other things. I nodded. She moved her hands around. The coins and chalk bobbed in the air. Isn't that hard? It is, Willem said, but our Kvoth is a bit of a show-off. That's why I've been so quiet, Sim said. I didn't know how you could hold 4 bindings at once. That's impressive as hell. I can do 5 if I need to, I said, but that's pretty much my limit. Sim smiled at Denna. One more thing. Watch this. He pointed at the floating piece of chalk. Nothing happened. Come on, Sim said plaintively. I'm trying to show her something. Then show her, I said smugly, leaning back in my chair. Sim took a deep breath and stared hard at the piece of chalk. It trembled. Will leaned close to Denna and explained. One sympathist can oppose another's alar, he said. It's just a matter of firmly believing that a drab is not the same as a silver penny at all. Will pointed, and the penny clattered to the tabletop. Foul, I protested, laughing. 2 on 1 isn't fair. It is in this case, Simmons said, and the chalk trembled again. Fine, I said, taking a deep breath. Do your worst. The chalk dropped to the table quickly, followed by the drab, but the silver talent stayed where it was. Sim sat back in his chair. You're creepy, he said, shaking his head. Fine, you win. Willem nodded and relaxed as well. Denna looked at me. So your alar is stronger than theirs put together? Probably not, I said, graciously. If they had practice working together, they could probably beat me. Her eyes ranged over the scattered coins. So that's it? She asked, sounding slightly disappointed. It's all just energy, money changing? There are other arts, I said. Sim does alchemy, for example. While I, Willem said, focus on being pretty. Denna looked us over again, her eyes serious. Is there a type of magic that's just... She wiggled her fingers vaguely. Just sort of writing things down? There's sigildry, I said. Like that bell in your room. It's like permanent sympathy. But it's still money-changing, right? She asked. Just energy? I nodded. Denna looked embarrassed as she asked, What if someone told you they knew a type of magic that did more than that? A magic where you sort of wrote things down and whatever you wrote became true. She looked down nervously, her fingers tracing patterns on the tabletop. Then, if someone saw the writing, even if they couldn't read it, it would be true for them. They'd think a certain thing or act a certain way depending on what the writing said. She looked up at us again, her expression a strange mix of curiosity, hope, and uncertainty. The three of us looked at each other. Willem shrugged. Sounds a damn sight easier than alchemy, Simmons said. I'd rather do that than spend all day unbinding principles. Sounds like fairy tale magic, I said. Storybook stuff that doesn't really exist. I certainly never heard about anything like that at the university. Denna looked down at the tabletop where her fingers still traced patterns against the wood. Her mouth was pursed slightly, her eyes distant. I couldn't tell if she was disappointed or simply thoughtful. Why do you ask? Denna looked up at me, and her expression quickly slid into a wry smile. She shrugged away the question. It was just something I heard, she said dismissively. I thought it sounded too good to be true. She looked over her shoulder. I seem to have outlasted my over-enthusiastic suitor, she said. Will held up the flat of his hand. We had an arrangement, he said. There was drink involved, and a woman's secret. I'll have a word with the barman before I leave, Denna said, her eyes dancing with amusement. As for the secret, there are two ladies sitting behind you. They've been making eyes at you for most of the evening. The one in green fancies Sim, while the one in short blonde hair seems to have a thing for sealdish men who focus on being pretty. We have already made note of them, Willem said without turning to look. Unfortunately, they are already in the company of a young Morrigan gentleman. The gentleman is not with them in any romantic sense, Dennis said. While the ladies have been eyeing you, the gentleman has been making it abundantly clear that he prefers redheads. She laid her hand on my arm possessively. Unfortunately for him, I have already staked my claim. I fought the urge to look at the table. Are you serious? I asked. Don't worry, she said to Will and Sim. I'll send Deok over to distract the Morrigan. That will leave the door open for the two of you. What's Deok going to do? Simmons said with a laugh. Juggle? Denna gave him a frank look. What? Simmons said. Deok isn't sly. Denna blinked at him. He and Stanchion own the Aeolian together, she said. Didn't you know that? They own the place, Sim said. They are not, together. Denna laughed. Of course they are. But Deok is up to his neck in women, Simon protested. He can't. Denna looked at him as if he were simple, then to Will and myself. The two of you knew, didn't you? Willem shrugged. I hadn't any knowledge of it, but small wonder he is a Basha. He is attractive enough. Will hesitated, frowned. Basha. What is a word for that here? A man who is intimate with both women and men? Lucky? Denna suggested. Tired? Ambidextrous? Ambisextrous, I corrected. That won't do, Denna chided me. If we don't have impressive-sounding names for things, no one will take us seriously. Sim blinked at her, obviously unable to come to grips with the situation. You see, Denna said slowly, as if explaining to a child, it's all just energy, and we can direct it in different ways. She blossomed into a brilliant smile, as if realizing the perfect way to explain the situation to him. It's like when you do this. She began to vigorously rub her hands up and down her thighs, mimicking his earlier motion. It's all just energy. By this point, Willem was hiding his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Simmons' expression was still incredulous and confused, but now it was also a furious, blushing red. I got to my feet and took Denna's elbow. Leave the poor boy alone, I said as I steered her gently toward the door. He's from Auteur. They're laced a little tightly in those parts. Okay, that's that. Yeah, I'll end there. Another short chapter is next, and I'll start that. I guess Sunday is the next day I'm doing this. Let's read. Did I miss comments here? Oh, wow. Okay, then she pulled out a Blue Eyes White Dragon. Yeah, it is. That was really fascinating, and I felt like I was learning true things. It's so believable. I don't know. It's like there's enough actual science that makes sense in the explanation to make it seem real. I also like how I feel like that whole conversation was kind of partially a way to remind the reader from the first book, because it's been so long, of how sympathy works, while also going, not being repetitive, but just, expounding on it more. Oh, you're welcome, John. Thanks for watching. So it's, giving examples of it, and, we kind of, learned about it. It was kind of explained before, but now we're seeing like examples of it, like real world examples with like a little bit more information. So that was like really fascinating to me. And yeah, I'm like really, this is like, I'm really feeling like the book is getting into like getting really good now. And I think Illidan is going to be a much more awesome character. Like, they're giving him a lot more of a prominent role in the book, and he's getting crazier, seems like, and I'm enjoying that a lot. Yeah, this was a fun few chapters. I like those a lot. I also like, I'm very, like, my mouth is like fatigued and dry, so I'm gonna end it here. And yeah, I think Sunday night I should be able to, around like 8 or 8:30, depending on what's going on with family stuff. I don't know. I will have to be going to a funeral soon, at some point, but I don't know when it is yet. But they're usually on weekends, so yeah, I don't know how long I'm gonna have to like be around family stuff, but I'll keep you posted in the chat and stuff. Okay, so you say, I'm assuming that's a way of saying goodbye. I wouldn't know the difference. None of it means anything to me. So, yeah, thanks for reading. This was a good distraction from the last few eventful days. And I love this book. Okay, I'll stop rambling, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks to everyone who was watching. I think I got more of a view count this time, which was kind of cool. Alright, bye.